So let's get started. My name is Christer Ljung. I work as a principal program manager in Microsoft Identity Engineering in an area we call CXP. If you're wondering where the dialect comes from, I'm from Sweden in Northern Europe, Scandinavia. And I work quite a lot with customers in the EMEA region, but it's a worldwide team. So I work with customers all over the world. And today's topic is about Azure AD B2C with the title Protect Your Brand with Azure Active Directory B2C and Zero Trust Security. I'm going to talk and I'm going to do 2 demos. And I mean, you might ask questions, you might write them in a chat window. I'll try to manage as much as possible and follow up. If you have a question and you feel comfortable opening mic, let's do that. But let's also try to see that we can get through the content here. I'll try to make some room at the end for a Q&A also. But let's get started. The Protect Your Brand with, etc. I need to start with this, P1 and P2, because it's not sort of obvious that we have a P2 and a P1 feature. If you do a search for Azure AD B2C pricing, you will land at this page because the pricing is actually shared with external identities, how you invite guest users in the enterprise. And that's why we have a common pricing page. And if you scroll down a little bit in this page, you will see that we do have a P1 and a P2 feature. So the second half of this talk is going to be what you have in the P2 feature and what that gives you. The first part is going to be common about Azure AD B2C in general, what it is as an orientation. So to start with, one thing that I just felt that I need to sort of start with to explain is the relationship between a B2C tenant and Azure subscriptions, because it happens that I meet customers and people who think that it's actually a resource that lives in an Azure subscription, much like storage, virtual machine, app services, Kubernetes clusters, and whatever. But it's really standalone. And the only thing you need a subscription and a resource group for is because you need to link it. When you create the B2C tenant, you need to point to resource group that lives in a subscription. And you do that because of billing, because you don't purchase a B2C tenant like you do with Azure AD, where you buy seats and licenses, E3, E5, and all that stuff. You deploy a B2C tenant, and then, as you saw in the previous page, if you go above 50K monthly active users, you will have to pay for the ones above it, which means where do we put that on the bill? Well, it will be on the resource group for the subscription that you linked your B2C tenant from. The subscription in itself is protected by an Azure AD directory. It could be your corporate one. It could be a separate one if you have created a standalone subscription. What does happen also is that you as a user, when you do deploy the first tenant, you become the initial global admin, the root user, etc. And you're the only one who can switch directory and start using this B2C tenant. If you add owners or contributors, etc., to this resource group, they don't really get access into the tenant. They can't switch a directory and start sort of doing stuff because they don't have access to the tenant. Only you as the initial admin have that, and you can invite users, perhaps from this tenant or from other tenants, into this B2C tenant to be able to give them access like a global admin, etc. That is why the user interface and the portal looks like this when you create a B2C tenant. You can give it a nice name. The more important thing is what's it going to be called, something like contoso.org on Microsoft.com. And this needs to be unique because it's the tenant name. You also pick a country, which we map to region where Azure data centers where B2C is actually available. So that it lands in the US if that is where your business is, or it lands in Europe or Australia, etc. Then you see down here that you need to link it to a B2C resource group in a subscription. So any of those available in the user that you currently signed in with in the portal will be available to you. The resource group, you can move that later, but I mean that's where the reason why you have to pick one. It's not like you're provisioning the B2C tenant into the subscription. It doesn't work like that. It's standalone. So just a short reminder of what B2C is, and I use the perspective here to compare it to Azure AD. This is Azure AD, and what's it's for, it's to create users and give them access to applications we use in our sort of work life, be it our collaboration suite, SharePoint, Outlook, Teams, whatever, be it enterprise apps that you configure in your tenant that you use within your company. You also have the new stuff like the passwordless, etc., one-time codes, authenticators that Azure AD is working with. A year and a half ago, we introduced that you could invite guest users in the B2B space from social providers like Facebook, Google, etc. So you actually can invite partners you collaborate with these applications, not just from Azure AD tenants, but from social providers also. Not everyone has an Azure AD tenant, and it's a bit silly to go and ask them to create one just because you want to share a few documents with them, even though they might have benefits with Azure AD in general. Azure AD also, many companies, you synchronize the identities from Windows Active Directory that you have on premises, back and forth, etc., to keep the cloud directory up to date. So when we flip here to Azure AD B2C, the screen is deliberately similar because it's quite similar in what it's doing. But the main thing that happened here is that the application side went a bit sort of neutral, grayish style. And that is because B2C, you cannot use it to be the authority for apps that we had in the previous page, like Microsoft's own collaboration suite, etc. Because even though it's Microsoft products, but if you take a B2C token that you issued and send it to Teams or to Outlook, it's going to reject it because it comes from the wrong issuer. It doesn't have an existence there. But the applications that you configured to be protected by B2C, yeah, by all means. I mean, B2C can issue JOT tokens, access tokens, SAML assertions, and you can work with them. On the left-hand side, going counterclockwise, the black, dark gray, and light gray rectangles here, they represent the other accounts. I mean, B2C can have local accounts, but you can also federate with identity providers, being your company's directory, being country, citizen, digital directories, etc., to enable you to federate and sign in or perhaps do other stuff with identity providers like that. B2C's sort of stronghold has always been that you can federate with almost anything that speaks OpenID or SAML, and of course you can connect them to meet the requirements, what's popular in the market where this application is being used, etc. In the lower left, we have the new stuff, the cool stuff like passwordless, etc., authenticator, even for B2C. I usually say that it comes sort of 2 steps behind Azure AD for the enterprise because it has to do with user maturity. How mature is the market out there for using all this new technology? In corporate IT, all of a sudden on a Monday, we force everyone, employee partners, etc., to use Authenticator, two-factor authentication, etc. But in the B2C space, which most often focus on consumer accounts, we can't just do that because you get a dropout. People don't want to use it. They're not trained or ready to use it, or they just don't feel it's important enough. So this gradually sort of makes its way into B2C, and the more accepted and ready consumers are for this, the more it will be introduced. And I think we're pretty soon at a breaking point where at least two-factor authentication is something that I see in conversations I have where it's being used quite a lot with B2C deployments. Bill asked a question if B2C has the ability to use an account that doesn't have an email. Absolutely. I'll show you that in one of the demos, perhaps not the phone number, but I think you will see that you can add other things. Good question. The other questions are a bit longer. I'll try to help you with that. But if we look at the B2C architecture, how does it compare to Azure AD in general, and how does it differ? I use 2 Lego bricks to explain this, a red and a blue one, where the underlying red one is your underlying tenant. It's where users, groups, applications are stored. It's very much like an Azure AD tenant because it looks and behaves close enough. You interact with this via the Graph API that we have. And this makes it, just the same as an Azure AD Enterprise tenant, because you can use Graph API to create users, to update users, to delete users. And in fact, much of these API calls that you make, you can see no difference between it being called to an enterprise tenant and a B2C tenant. There are some differences because if you make calls to it about sort of device information or information that B2C doesn't really care about or have functionality for, you will be able to make these calls, but they may give you an error code saying that, no, you can't do this here. Because that's not how B2C works. The red layer is also, since it's storage, it's the persistence layer. So if you choose United States when you created it, that means that the red Lego piece will be deployed in Azure data centers in the US. If you choose a country in Europe, it means that it will be deployed, the red Lego layer will be deployed into data centers in Europe. Same for Asia and Australia. The red piece is also deployed in multiple data centers, which means that you don't have a single point of failure. It's deployed in multiple data centers that get synchronized. So you do have resilience there. But if we take the case of Europe and EU, which is a common question, does the data remain in EU? Yes, it does. We just have multiple replicas in more data centers. And we have the blue piece on top. That is sort of what makes B2C unique, because the red layer is pretty similar to an Azure AD Enterprise tenant. But the blue layer is really what makes it unique, because that is the policy engine. It holds the policy configuration and it knows the protocols and the way we interact with them. This one, you can think of it that it's been executed globally, meaning that even it could be executing in a data center where you don't really have the data stored, just to sort of offload to your nearest point of presence. When you interact with B2C, you can either interact with it on the blue layer or on the red layer, because when I sign into the portal to do the first piece of configuration on policy, etc., I don't have anything in the blue layer. It's empty. So I can't really sign in via policy because no one exists. I need to bootstrap that. So when I sign into the portal, I'm actually signing in on the tenant level, on the red level. But my application and the end users, when they sign in, they should not do the same, because it's only IT admins that really should log into the red layer. Users will hit the blue policy engine and will do that via an endpoint that has a little bit of a different name. It's called whatever your tenant name was, and b2clogin.com. And you will talk to the blue Lego piece in either OpenID, OAuth, or SAML. That's what it speaks. When the policy engine is executing, I mean, it do talk to the red layer to sort of read and write and load the user profile, etc. So they work together. This means that sometimes we get questions, do B2C support this? And our documentation may say no, but usually what that means is it's not supported in the blue layer. It is supported in the red layer. One obvious example is the OpenID OAuth for client credentials. If you look at, or if you do an internet search, do B2C support client credentials? And you see, no, it doesn't. What it means then is you can't invoke the B2C login endpoint, hit a policy, and ask for client credentials. But you can do it on the red layer because that's how you do it, and that's supported. speaking of client credentials, we are bringing that forward. You will see that in public preview soon. The policy engine then, what it does, it executes what we call a user journey. And that is, you can think of it as a workflow. Goes from start to stop. And it has a series of steps that you configure what should happen, what different types of identity providers is available. If I do a sign up, how should that happen? What should we ask for? Should we have additional steps like forcing the user to accept the terms of use, etc.? Should we have MFA at all? And if so, should we sign up? When we sign up, we need to verify the phone number. And when we sign in, should we do it in every user journey, or should we do it in special user journeys when you're trying to access sort of specific pages that where you should challenge the user? You can also configure the user journey to do callouts via REST APIs to backend services to exchange information, do validations, eventing to send events that something happens, etc. Yes, we do read the user profile, etc. with the underlying directory. And you can also integrate with things like Dynamics 365 fraud protection that I'll talk a little bit more later. This way of using the policy comes in two flavors. They're called user flows and custom policies. You can think of them as basic and advanced, because the user flows, they're things that you configure in the portal. You don't need to open a text editor or anything, but it's really just policies that we at Microsoft have created, and we give you options sort of to configure them in the easy way in the portal. The custom policies, or identity experience framework as the official name is, that is where you say, what I'm about to do is requires me to configure it myself. So I will get a set of files that are in XML where I do the configuration myself, and I upload them and we execute them. You can mix and match. So for instance, the sign in, if you're happy with the user flow that only does sign in, you can use the basic version of that. But if the sign up is more complex, you might revert to using custom policies for that. So it's not sort of a binary choice that you have to do either or. So before we go to the first demo, we get questions like, can B2C do this and can B2C do that, etc. If you step out and look at sort of what is a solution that you deploy, everything is not in B2C. The total solution will probably use some other functions and features that you have in Azure in order to create the total solution for you. One such thing is probably Azure Monitor, to set up the monitoring of your tenant. That works very much like it does for Azure AD in the enterprise, because the red Lego piece at the bottom works the same way, so you can connect it and you can get the audit logs and sign-in logs out to Azure Monitor. So an answer there would be, do you support monitoring and audit? Yes, we do. We have audit logs and sign-in logs inside B2C, but you probably are going to use Azure Monitor to process them. Another thing is, on the client side, do you support this and that? We're probably talking about using something on the client side, like a component here called MCEL, Microsoft Authentication Library, in order to do certain things on the client side, meaning mobile phone or browser application. So with that said, let's switch to some demos and start to show things. The first thing I'm going to do is just to point out, we have P2 and we have P1. We see that a lot of customers stay on P1, and that's good. But if you're below 50,000 monthly active users, it's actually free to enable P2 and get the other goodies that exist in P2. And how you do that, this is an Azure subscription. I'll show you that because it's quite simple. You need to find the resource group where you link the B2C tenant to begin with. So I'll do that. I have mine in a resource group called B2C my name B2C, and you see I have a set of tenants here. So if I were to pick, and you see the location, etc. If I go to one of them, I call this USA, you see in the overview information, you see a little bit of detail, not much because I really managed the tenant when I switch directory into the tenant. But one thing I see here is the pricing tier. It says P1, Premium P1. So what I can do is I can just flip this and press save. And if I have as I said, a tenant that I never reach 50K monthly active users, it's not going to cost me anything. So I'll just do that and press save, and it's going to save that for me. And from then on, it's a P2. Come on, I did try to close you. It's a P2, and when that action kicks in, this will be refreshed. You can do the opposite, so you can downgrade it to P1 again if you just do this for testing, etc. But as I said, it's still free if you move it to P2, and why not take advantage of that? So let's go to the portal and go to one of my lab directories. You see here that I got a little bit of styling. I got the shot from the moon and a little special logo type. There's nothing special with B2C for that. That comes from the red Lego piece and how you can do directory styling. So I'll go into Azure AD B2C, and here you see a few options. Some of them are shared with the Azure AD tenant, like app registration, users, etc. It's because it would be not a good way of working if we didn't replicate them here. You needed to go back and forth or have multiple tabs, etc. So some are sort of duplicated, and it doesn't really matter if I go in and do user management in the Azure AD blade, because I mean it's the same. It will be the same users, the same panel that shows up. And as a matter of fact, for some operations like working with groups, there's no mentioning of groups here, but if you do use groups in the red Lego piece, you need to go into Azure Active Directory to do that. There is no cost alert to avoid a surprise, because I mean it happens when it happens all of a sudden, and this is sort of also the accounting for this it's not. I mean, it isn't real time, but when people sign in, you accumulate that, and then you see how many unique users you have at the end of it. So at the moment when you sign in, you really don't know if you're going to be above 50K. It is sort of an accounting thing afterwards, but there is no way that you can set a warning on it. You can set a spend limit on the subscription and resource group, and the normal way you can do in Azure. Good. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to take the basic one and create a user flow. So let's do that now. I can do that later. So let's let's run a user flow. And you saw perhaps that I had created here, I'm going back to identity providers. I had set up a few here. I've set up a federation with Facebook, Google. I have local accounts, and I have configured an Azure AD tenant, not a B2C, but a corporate tenant. I've set up the federations for how that works, the magic client ID and secret, how we exchange claims with them, etc. So when I go to the basic one, the user flow here, I have a few. I'm going to pick the one that is called SUSI2, sign up, sign in. If I go to identity providers, I can click to say which ones should be valid in this policy when I try to sign in. And I've configured to do email sign up, Google, and the Azure AD Federation. With this, I've also done a little bit of extra configuration. I haven't reverted to the custom policies yet. I'm using the plain one. I've said that no JavaScript. If you don't use JavaScript, disable it, and B2C will make sure that no JavaScript runs except B2C's own. I've also configured a couple of things here, like how long should the access token actually live, etc. 60 minutes, like that. You can tweak it if you want to have shorter or longer. And yeah, and on the page layouts, I've also done a little thing. I've said that I want to use a custom page here. And all that does is you'll see that I will get a little sort of thing at the bottom of the sign-in page with the logo type and a short sort of notice that by using the platform, you're accepting the terms of service, etc. So I'm actually pulling in my own HTML here, even though this is the basic version. But let's run this. In the portal, you get the option of sort of quickly just run it. You need to have an application to sign into, but that's that. I'll run this. So this is the sign-in page. You see that it takes the B2C tenant styling, puts the claim in here. I selected my Azure AD tenant, Google, and you see the footer here that is there. I'm going to use Google here and go to the federation with a Google account. I'll pick a demo account I have. B2C actually redirected to Gmail, Google here. I'll use my Gmail account. It's configured. This is a decision made by Google. Say that, hey, if you're using this, you need to have a one-time code to verify that it's really you so you don't get hacked. B2C hasn't sort of configured this. This is the first time I sign up. So when I'm returning to the B2C policy, I need to do some things. We got the first name, last name from Google, but perhaps I want to change it. I selected some silly name when I signed up, and I don't want that in this application. So I get the chance to change it. What this policy also does is B2C wants to challenge you to see that you're really in possession of this email account. So we do the email verification here. So let's do that. That was fast. So, oops. This is This is not mandatory. It's just the way that I selected this this user flow to work. So I signed in and I get a token from B2C. The test app is redirecting to jot.ms just to sort of display the token. I see that is being issued by my tenant, B2C login and a tenant ID. This is where it differs from Azure AD for the enterprise because it will say something like STS Windows Net. And this is also why I can't send this token to Teams or Outlook because it's going to say, no, it doesn't come from me. So let's see. The subject is the newly created user. So if I flip over to Firefox here and a tool called the Microsoft Graph Explorer, which is it's like a query tool where you can write graph queries directly to the underlying tenant, the red Lego piece. So if I do that and query a newly created user, that was the user ID, I'll pull up the full details of the user profile. Much of it is sort of null and blank, etc., because we didn't fill in the details. But some claims and some attributes are actually filled in, like the display name. One interesting thing here is also to notice there's a collection called identities. And this collection governs how can I sign in? How can a user authenticate and match itself onto this user profile? And in this case, you see we have the standard one is sort of just a user principal name here that you really don't use. B2C just fabricates that one. But you see that the first element says that this is a federated account. It's actually federated and the issuer is Google. And this long series of digit is that's the Google ID that I have. So let's do something funny here. Because let's save this because I can't remember this in my head. And let's be wild and crazy and delete this user directly. Like this. The user is gone, doesn't exist anymore, and it's not there. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to rerun this policy. with the local account that I have, that I've signed up with, like this. And it's going to authenticate me, validate my local password in the tenant, and give me the token. Now I'm going to steal the user ID for this local account. Go back to Graph Explorer and query the user object and show you the difference. Same thing. It's got a little details here about myself, and you'll see in the identity section that this time it looks a little bit different. It's got two entries, the user principal name that we're not using, and then it says you can log in via an email address. But what if we want to change this? And this is a common question. Can I sort of merge accounts? Can I add something afterwards so that this user has multiple ways of logging in? And yes, you can. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to patch the account. I'm going to take the notepad thing that I saved that identifies the Google account, and I'm going to add this here in this JSON structure to say, well, this user is going to have more options on how to sign in. It's the same user account that I signed in with locally before, so I'm going to be able to sign in with my email address or the federated Google account, regardless which. Is going to match me in this user profile with this particular account, and it's going to sign me in. So I need to do a patch here and just pass in this to say, please patch this part of the user profile like that. And I have some issues with JSON like that. Yep, now it actually worked. Let's just refresh to make sure that it actually happened. And sure enough, the user profile has the new way of signing in. So if everything works as it should, please remember, or we can the 6 CD. Let's do it like this so we can compare. I'll open a second window. I'll sign in as the federated Google account this time. The account that I previously deleted, so it really shouldn't be there. And voila, I could sign in. And if I flip between these two sort of tabs, you'll see that the subject, meaning the user's object ID, 6CD, it is the same. One page says that I signed in like this, doesn't mention Google at all. And the other page says that, yeah, it's still the same user account, but you authenticated via Google. So this is what we call account linking, or giving the user multiple ways of signing in. So, yep, that was that. And just a quick demo also of the client side. This is a sample, a regular MSAL Azure AD sample, where I've configured it to authenticate via Azure AD B2C. I've added a little extra buttons here just to be able to illustrate what is really going on the client side when you do authenticate. So I'm going to use the same authentication mechanism like this and sign in and list the token cache. Be it a smartphone app or a browser or a desktop app, when it interacts with B2C, I mean, it receives tokens, and you have a local token cache, and they have a lifetime. In this case, I've tuned it down quite a bit. So I have an ID token and some access token. I can get other tokens by sort of talking to the identity provider. And since I already have a session identifying myself, I don't need to authenticate. So if this application needs to call an API, I don't have the access token for this, so it will first need to go and talk to the identity provider, but I don't need to re-authenticate. And you saw that this line popped up, and I got a new set of access tokens for that application, so I can talk to it. And if I pull up the network tab here and repeatedly call this this API, you'll see that it calls just something called read. If I do the same thing for the write API, it's going to say, do you have in your local cache an access token for write? I don't. So I'm going to interact with B2C as an identity provider to get it. You see, we did something called token here. We're calling B2C to say, hey, can you give me an access token for this API write? And by the way, I'm passing my SSO cookie here. So this is me, I'm authenticated. This is what happens on the client side. It's really not sort of B2C. It's the client library you have. You interact with the blue piece and the two Lego pieces to using protocols like OpenID or OAuth or SAML to get what you want. Close this one out like this. So that was that, and yeah, I'll close this one down too, and I don't need that one anymore. Yeah, I'm short of time, so I'm going to skip the SAML assertions, but B2C can speak SAML also. So customer protection. What I showed you, that sort of what you can get with Azure AD in P2, it's in P1, and it just works as an identity provider. But what if you want sort of more? If you want to protect your application to make sure that it's really secure, what options do you have? Well, when a user signs in, you can put something like Azure Front Door in front of it. Azure Front Door is a WAF application firewall. It also enables custom domains for you. And then you can use identity protection, but that you can only use in the P2 feature. That's why I think you should bump it up to P2 for all tenants you have that are below 50K, because it's more or less a no-brainer. And it could be real-time aggregations of who you are when you try to sign in, where do you come from, what IP address, etc. Or you come from a malicious network that we have detected that there's something funny going on there. Or when you sign in, does your sign-in criteria match something that Microsoft have identified that this is leaked credentials, etc., or another threat? This puts sort of two things in play. Is the user itself at risk with leaked credentials, or is this sort of sign-in activity, is this at risk? And we do a measure here to say how riskful is this, green, yellow to red. We have the conditional access part that helps you to evaluate this and take actions, like what should you do? Just allow it, require MFA, etc., and take other actions. Beside that, you can bypass this and everything is good, but there might be that the activity that is going on is still borderline legitimate. Like you have a campaign and you want to make sure that no one is signing up 1,000 times just to get a good discount or win a contest or whatever. That is where Dynamics 365 fraud protection comes into play, because it can help you to do extra checks to see, is this sign in really legitimate according to your sort of rules and purposes. And then of course you can have Azure monitoring, so you can see what's going on. And all of a sudden you have 3 million logins from some place in the world, and you can see that, oh, what's happening here, etc. If we start with Azure Front Door, that's a WAF, and it's a component that exists in Azure that you deploy, and you deploy it separately. The things that are there for B2C are really the custom domain and the WAF. The other things, it's not so much for B2C, because SSL offloading, application accelerating, B2C in itself is a cloud service, so you don't need that. But many customers do want custom domain, which you can get with Azure Front Door. So you don't have my tenant b2clogin.com, you want to have contoso.com. So it looks very much like your application. That's achievable via Front Door. The other thing is you can start using the WAF in Front Door and get a higher protection against DDoS, etc. And configure it with all the good stuff that is in Azure Front Door to protect the logging part of your application more. You could, of course, sort of route the traffic to your application, what it's doing after sign in through the same WAF. But since the interaction to the blue Lego piece goes via the front door, you can take advantage of it here. And how this works is, I mean, the user goes via the browser in this case, says, hey, I want to log into Contoso Bank Co. UK. It does a lookup and it sees that, well, that maps to your front door deployment. So it's going to take care of it, do all its sort of WAF checks, bot origins, header, body, query parameters, IP addresses, whatever you configure it to do, and then going to route it to the front door functionality that works with B2C. And this is B2C and front door knows each other. So B2C sees that this comes from front door, etc., and makes sure to acknowledge the custom domain in everything it's doing in the other replies, etc. So identity protection, where it's about detection, remediation, and investigation. Users can be at risk for many things. I mean, leaked credentials, threats, etc. What we said before, malicious IP addresses, atypical travel, password spray attacks, etc. What you do with identity protection and conditional access is basically sort of deciding, given that we score this sign-in for you, what should you do? Should you allow it or should you block it? Should you take actions like require MFA or force password reset? You need to take action somewhere. Or if you use conditional access, you don't have to, but if you have the P2 feature, you can create user journeys and policies that take advantage of them. And it looks like this, that assigning comes with different attributes, like what type of sign-in are you using? Are you using Google, etc.? Are you using a business account? Where do you come from physically? What network? What type of application are you using? Are you using a Tor browser, etc.? So the sign-in has a lot of information with it that goes into the machine learning functionality that we use for all sign-ins in Microsoft, Xbox, Azure AD for the enterprise, OneDrive, etc. All items are sort of processed here in the same machine learning process. And out comes the scoring where you can decide what actions to take and how your application should behave here. Sort of to also to illustrate what a normal customer journey includes, not just from B2C, but in any case where you sign up. I mean, account creation, you face the risk of fake accounts and synthetic identities. When you do login, it could be compromised, etc. It could be phishing, brute force. When you're trying to do a purchase, you have the fraud of different categories here, etc. And all this needs to sort of be handled one way or the other. B2C does it parts, conditional access also, but Dynamics Fraud Protection may help you with things like, well, in the fraud category, and it also might help you with device fingerprinting, because B2C doesn't really do that. So if we look into, if we go back to the screen here, if we go back to the B2C portal and we back out of here like this, fresh again. Yeah, like this. What happens when I create a user flow is I get a few options here. What should it do? Sign up, sign in. I'll pick that one. Then you get a selection down here that says version. Could be a little more helpful in saying what it really means. But if you pick the recommended, you can create a sign-in journey that includes conditional access. Call it A. So it doesn't really matter, but let's call it like that. I allow email, sign up. I'll allow Google again and my Azure AD tenant. We can authenticate via email. I could here set that you can do it via a phone call, etc., SMS callbacks. but I'm just going to leave it at emails. I could say that MFA is enforced via conditional access. I'm not going to turn it off by completely. I'm not going to turn it on to say everyone has to do it. I'm going to say conditional, meaning that if the score indicates we should do it, let's do it. I'm also going to click this one, and that's you only get in the recommended to say, I do want conditional access to be part of this policy so that I get the benefit from it. Just add a few of these just because it's fun. And yeah, that's good. And create this user flow. So I haven't, the test account, I haven't ruined it. I haven't done things that is going to be blocked for. So if I use this policy and sign in, nothing really happens. It's the same thing that you saw previously. It authenticates, it checks the user ID and password and signs me in. But then if I back out and go to conditional access, if you use this for the Azure AD for the enterprise, I mean, it's pretty much the same, but I can start building myself a policy here. Block me as a user in Switzerland. I'll block by geo. So I'll pick my test account like this, but I don't block everyone. I'll pick myself just for fun. I'll pick just one application, so I don't lock myself out. I'll pick my ABC test app. I'm going to block, have the policy work on location. So let's pick a selected location, and I happen to have one defined with Switzerland with all the countries' IP addresses. I just picked Switzerland because there's a data center there. So sorry if you're from Switzerland and feel offended. And I'll say block. I'll be tough here to say if you sign in with this account from Switzerland, I'm going to block you. You can have this in different modes here, report only, which is good to see what is happening if you apply this policy before you start to block people. You will only get sort of the results in the sign-in logs. But I'm going to say on by default like this. So here we have the policy, and if everything works, I should be able to still sign in with this user flow like that. Because I'm not from Switzerland, I'm actually in Sweden. Yep, like this, I was able to log in. But if I switch to a virtual machine that I have deployed and try to do the same. First, I'll prove to you that I'm actually in Switzerland. I'll go to one of those sites that will tell you your breakout IP address, and you'll see that this is in Zurich in Switzerland, where we have a data center, and country is CH, which is short for Switzerland. And I need to grab the URL that sort of kickstarts the sign-in flow. To run it from Switzerland, and if the demo gods are with me, I'm using the right, and try to sign in. It will give me the default message. I can change this to say, hey, you can't do this. You're blocked. And this is conditional access that kicks in. If I back out, run the same policy, but I'll this time just for fun, I'll use the Azure AD federated account. Oh, I had an SSO session from the dry run, but you see, this is not the same account. It's a Azure AD account called Megan Bowen that comes from an Azure AD tenant. So I was able to sign in from Switzerland using this account. So it's only blocking me. And that is what you get with P2. You can't get this without P2. So if you want to start building your policies, you need P2. If you're using custom policies, you can be more granular in how you want to sort of behave when we tell you that there is something that needs to your remediation. So with that, we're at the end of the session. And I saw a question coming by, will you get the slides later? Yes, you will absolutely get the slides from this deck. Let's see, 4 minutes left, so I'll try to go through the questions in the IAM window. And sorry for not doing this earlier. Do you need a Dynamics 365 subscription? Good question, Dean. No, you can get Dynamics fraud protection standalone. You don't need to have Dynamics the complete suite. Do you recommend creating a separate CA policy for B2C apps? You need to, because I mean the policy lives within the B2C tenant. You cannot sort of borrow the ones that you have from your enterprise. I've switched directories and I'm in the B2C tenant, and the B2C policy blocked me in Switzerland. It only lives in the B2C tenant. If I understood the question correct. Custom domain for course, well, it's not really course. B2C will do the right thing for course anyway. But if you switch to a custom domain, it will do course correctly. And if you have JavaScripts that are using both, perhaps that will solve your problem too. Michael Long, if you enable conditional access in the tenant, it will impact the users signing in via older versions of the browser. Yeah, you're absolutely right. You need to be careful, and that's why I recommend that you run it in report only for a while to see what's actually happening. So you don't turn this on Monday morning and all of a sudden you get angry phone calls from help desk saying that customers cannot sign in. Oh, thank you, Dean. Let's see. The scrolling in the team section is not working with me. See if Ali, regarding MSAL, I've noticed that ID token expiry is different. It expires 10 minutes earlier than the access token. That shouldn't really be the case. If you do the initial ID token, access token, and you haven't configured them differently, they should have the same length. But I mean, you can go in and tweak them and the lifetime of it. On behalf of support is not supported in B2C. That's correct. And that's back to the red Lego piece and the blue Lego piece. And if you invoke the policy, it does not understand the on behalf flow. We are working on it. So we plan to support it going forward. I do not have a timeline for that. Can we get the sample code up? It's the standard. If you search for Azure AD B2C MSAL node sample, it's that. If it is with this sort of the token cache, etc., I'll add a link to another GitHub repo for the tweak code if you want to use that. Any questions I've missed before we close?
Yeah, we're at the top of the hour, so people are dropping off. So thank you so much for joining us today and for being so engaged in the conversation with so many great questions. And thank you to the folks who've been helping answer questions. That's been really great.
Yes, thank you.
And I put a link to Microsoft Q&A. If we didn't get to your question, that's a great place to go and add your question. And Christer and other folks from Microsoft will go on and answer your questions as soon as they can. And I also put a link to a survey if you want to provide feedback on this call, or if you have any suggestions for topic ideas for future calls. That will be awesome to hear as well from you so that we can meet all your needs. And thank you so much. Have a great day.
Thank you very much. Thank you.